Hello. Yeah, I'm just hoping that I can be heard okay. Let me check one sec. Hello? All right, looks good so far. Okay, sorry. Just kind of getting used to how to do this here. So I did my presentation on Gestalt psychology. Um, I was more interested in Gestalt psychology because it was less about biology and less about behavior and cognition. Well, it's about cognition, all psychology is, but it was less about like it seemed less mechanical and more about like um discovering things about consciousness and perception. There are more kind of like foundational theories involved, which I always find to be more interesting about psychology, kind of like a philosophy of mind, what people are thinking about, um, how the mind works and how consciousness and perception works. Those are all interesting topics. So Gestalt psychology. I thought it would be important to start with what is Gestalt psychology. As we're aware, there are schools of thought in psychology. Gestalt is one of these. It began in Germany and spread to the United States around the time of World War II. Um, it hold on. Yeah, I'm a little bit nervous about this presentation here. But so it basically with Gestalt, one of the things that kind of like was distinctive about it, that kind of made a name for it, was that it contested some of the principles at the root of psychology as it was known in the early 1900s. Wundt was considered the father of psychology, and the German psychologists who were beginning Gestalt had a philosophical problem with Wundt's concept of elementalism, which is defined in the textbook as the belief that complex mental behavioral processes are composed of or derived from simple elements, and that the best way to understand these processes is to find the elements of which they are composed. So basically, with that definition of elementalism, um, they believed the whole was just like the sum of many parts. So if you were able to kind of like dissect the whole into parts, you could kind of like put it back together and then you would get kind of the whole. So this was something that Gestaltists disagreed with. Um, I can go on to say kind of like an example of this type of thinking would be Titchener. He continued William Wundt's school of voluntarism and started basically is thought of as beginning experimental psychology. So he would kind of like do experiments around uh, introspection, and he was attempting to classify the structures of the mind like chemists classify the elements of nature into the periodic table. So he thought that if you could just break apart elements of the mind or of consciousness, that you could understand the relationships between these elements, kind of like put them back together and create the whole. So Gestaltists would view this as reductive thinking about the mind, and they objected to this approach to psychology. They prefer to focus on meaningful, intact, and conscious experiences, or experience as it appears to the naive observer. So just like if you're at the beach, you know, you see an umbrella, they would instead of trying to dissect like elements of your experience of this umbrella and like trying to break apart the experience of perceiving this object, they would just be like, well, kind of more like, yeah, I guess just like why why this is perceived kind of like as a whole or something, or like we'll get into that. It was called the molar approach rather than the molecular approach. The molecular approach reduced consciousness or behavior to basic elements. So yeah, they basically, let's see. So the foundation of Gestalt was that the belief that consciousness cannot be reduced to elements without distorting the true meaning of the experience. So this is kind of more about what I was saying about the molar approach. Like, I think that they believe we had to take into context like the meaning of your experience of what you're like the context of your experience as well. So there were Immanuel Kant was of great influence to Gestalt, and the foundation of Gestalt also was a paper on phi motion that Wertheimer published in his studies on phi motion. So the Gestaltists believe the brain makes sensory experience more structured and organized, and thus more meaningful, and organizes sensory experiences into perception. So this is, again, kind of like more about what I was talking about. The molar approach, you don't want to distort the true meaning of experience by breaking it into parts. You also want to consider the perception rather than kind of like breaking down things into parts. You want to consider the perception as a whole and maybe what it means to the observer in the context that it means that. So Immanuel Kant, Gestalt psychologists got the idea that our brains filter sensory experience from Immanuel Kant, who believed the mind adds structure to our conscious experience that sensory stimulation doesn't. So the Gestaltists were influenced by Immanuel Kant. They believed Immanuel Kant kind of saw the mind as like a mediator between the senses and reality. The Gestaltists prefer to see it as the brain that's the mediator between the senses and reality, and they basically studied consciousness as it originates in the brain. So the concept of phi motion was really essential to the beginnings of Gestalt. It was basically a perceptual phenomenon where there appears to be motion to our mind's eye, but in reality, there isn't motion. There's just an illusion of motion. So an example of this could be, you know, when you see a movie, it is in reality a series of slow frames. So Wertheimer was experimenting with something called a toy stroboscope that flashed pictures sequentially so they appeared to move. And then he continued experimenting with another instrument that would flash light. And when he would shorten the interval between these flashes of light, the light would appear to like move back and forth or from side to side. So he was trying to explain like, so there's what's actually happening. And then there's our perception of the sensory information that's happening. And so he was trying to explain like why we were perceiving that these lights were moving when they were actually just flashing at different times. Because he felt that this exemplified the idea that our perceptions are different from the sensations that comprise our perceptions. So, for example, like we were talking about, how like Titchener and Wundt would believe that if you broke apart a perception, you could into sensations, you could then put it together and it would kind of equal the sum of the parts would equal the whole. But Wertheimer was kind of like, no, I don't think that's the case. These the perception of these sensations isn't really equivalent to the parts of the sensation. Like our brain is creating a different phenomena from what the senses, the sensory sensations are. So the this was the beginning of further investigation into concepts surrounding how the brain perceives phenomena. So phenomena is just that which naturally appears in consciousness. So Wertheimer's idea that our perceptions are structured in ways that sensory stimulation is not was again exemplified by his paper on phi motion and could be said to be inspired by Immanuel Kant, who believes the mind adds structure to our conscious experience. So Kant, similar to Gestaltists, as we said, believed that the conscious experience is a result of the interaction between the faculties of the mind and the sensory stimulation, rather than just a product of the senses. So there's a difference between the act of perception and sensation. So so what I wanted to say about phi motion was just that basically Wertheimer was arguing with Wundt or about why this phenomenon couldn't be explained the way that Wundt believed it to be explainable. So Wundt believed that these sensations were like recognizable patterns to the muscles in our eye, and that's why we perceived there to be motion when these lights were flashed. And Wertheimer believed that it didn't have to do with just the sensations triggering learning or muscle memory, but that because he could show that our perception of movement was like incompatible with the way the muscles were moving, because he would show like the light appeared to be moving in two separate directions at once. So he said the only way that he believed that this could be explained was that the brain consists of structural fields of electrochemical forces that exist prior to sensory stimulation. So these fields of brain activity transform data and give the data characteristics it otherwise would not possess. So in Wertheimer's view, the whole exists prior to the parts or the individual sensations, and it is the whole that gives the parts their identity and meaning. So that's pretty much the foundations of Gestalt there. And this was also the beginning of the concept of isomorphism, which we'll cover closer to the end of this presentation. So this, the beginning of Gestalt psychology, again, was Max Wertheimer's paper that he published on apparent motion, or the phi phenomenon, in 1912. And as I discussed on the previous slide, the finding of the phi phenomenon was significant because it exemplified the idea that our perceptions are different from the sensations that comprise them. So this was the evidence supporting further investigation into concepts surrounding how the brain perceives phenomena, or that which naturally appears in consciousness. So he believed now that we have kind of like proof that our perceptions are something kind of independent of the sensory stimulus that we receive, we can kind of study more about how perception is working independently of the separate sensations that comprise it. Maybe not completely independently, but it's kind of like a different phenomena altogether. So Wertheimer related this phenomenon to a coherent, the phi phenomenon, to a coherent system of explanatory principles that gave it a central place in psychology. If you don't mind, well, I'm going to pause this for a second just to check the sound. Hello? Okay. So yeah, I honestly don't know if like all about the pausing and restarting and stuff, like just doing my best. I'm gonna try to resume this, okay? Oops. So the founders of Gestalt, there were three of them. Max Wertheimer, he was alive from 1880 to 1943. He left Germany during World War II and came to teach in America. His article in 1912 about perception is taken as the formal beginning of the School of Gestalt Psychology. Sorry, so I guess the experimental studies of the perception of movement probably would have been about the Phi phenomena. So he basically started at Max Wertheimer. He wrote a book before his death on productive thinking. And he started Gestalt with research assistants Kurt Koffka and Wolfgang Kohler, who acted as his subjects also in his perception experiments. So productive thinking was, I guess it was just about like how productive thinking naturally is, kind of like how it naturally occurs, how people naturally solve problems, and that had implications for schooling. He just wanted to, I think, improve. He probably wanted to improve the quality of education. So Kurt Koffka from 1886 to 1941. He also, so I might have gotten these confused, but he popularized Gestalt with an article in the Psychological Bulletin in 1922 titled Perception, an Introduction to Gestalt Theory. So it was Wertheimer who basically did his article about movement, the Phi phenomena. So he started kind of like the theory of Gestalt at that point. He kind of like wanted to emphasize the difference between perception and sensation. And then Kurt Koffka was writing about perception to introduce Gestalt theory in 1922, which led a lot of American psychologists to believe that Gestalt was primarily or exclusively about perception, which it isn't. It has other applications as well. He also published a book called Principles of Gestalt Psychology in 1935. He theorized about objective and subjective reality and memory. So one of the things that's so interesting about Gestalt is there are a lot of theories. Here's a quote from Kafka. Yep, there he is. It has been said the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It is more correct to say that the whole is something else than the sum of its parts, because summing up is a meaningless procedure, whereas the whole part relationship is meaningful. So that's what we were talking about. That's pretty much the main concept of Gestalt. Wolfgang Kohler, around from 1887 to 1967. He participated in research that was to launch the Gestalt movement with Wertheimer and Koffka, but then he was interrupted by an invitation to study chimpanzees on Tenerife just before the World War I, at which point he started working as a spy for the German military during World War I. Something that he was kind of known for was that he criticized the use of operationalism in US psychologists. So I thought that was pretty cool. He was convinced that measuring, so he talks about this guy Fechner. He's criticizing him. He's saying, apparently Fechner was convinced that measuring as such would make a science out of psychology. Today, we can no longer doubt that thousands of quantitative psychophysical experiments were made almost in vain. No one knew precisely what he was measuring. nobody had studied the mental processes upon which the whole procedure was built. So basically, people were trying to measure to make things seem more scientific, but they didn't know like the concept that they were trying to experiment on. They didn't know enough about it. They didn't know what to measure about it to represent this concept. They hadn't studied these processes or concepts enough. So they're building these procedures and experiments, but on a shaky foundation, on a, they just don't have like, yeah, there's no basis for it. So these are some foundational concepts in Gestalt: isomorphism, the law of Pragnaz, psychophysical isomorphism, perception or perceptual gestalten, subjective and objective reality, the Gestalt explanation of learning, insightful learning, productive thinking, memory process, memory trace, and trace system. So I'll try to go over these briefly. So isomorphism was came from the demonstrations of phi motion, as we were talking about earlier. So yeah, it's basically the evidence for looking at perception, and for studying perception is kind of like a separate phenomena than sensation. And it's just the idea that structural fields in the brain transform data and give data characteristics it wouldn't possess. Okay. So I'm gonna check on that. I know there's also psychophysical isomorphism. Yeah, so the isomorphism is basically like an introduction to psychophysical isomorphism, which is the concept that experienced order in space is always structurally identical with a functional order in the distribution of underlying brain processes, or the psychological facts and the underlying events in the brain resemble each other in all their structural characteristics. So the Gestalt notion of it stresses that the brain transforms the data, and we experience this transformed data consciously, and the patterns of brain activity and conscious experience are structurally equivalent, with perceptual fields always being caused by underlying brain patterns of brain activity. So that's kind of an interesting perspective. These concepts weren't really discussed, I think, before Gestalt. Freud was around at the same time, but he wasn't, I don't think he was looking at consciousness in the same way. He was more interested in like kind of like literary, symbolic stuff, I think. So with isomorphism, it's kind of complicated, but it's just like, it's about the creation of perception and how there's kind of like a mirror between like our reality and the brain kind of mirror each other, basically. With the brain actually adding to the process of perception. There's also the law of Pragnaz, which states that psychological organization will always be as conditions allow under the prevailing circumstances. Just as with other force fields and cognitive experiences will tend to be as organized, symmetrical, simple, and as regular as they can be given the pattern of brain activity at any moment. So you could kind of like imagine the brain as like a magnetic field, and it operates in like a consistent way, an organized way. And so basically humans, their psychological organization of humans is always like the best and most regular that it can be. So things are always working as optimally as they can. Perception and perceptual Gestalten, it's kind of interesting. I could have maybe included some figures. They're kind of like optical illusions that were studied, configurations by which visual information is arranged in our perception were studied, and over 100 configurations were isolated, by which visual information is arranged kind of like in the brain. Like it was thought the brain kind of like completed these pictures in a way. Perceptual constancy was a kind of like a foundational concept for perceptual gestalten. And it refers to the way we respond to objects as if they are the same, even though how they appear to us may vary greatly. And there were arguments between different fields of thought, like the empiricists. The empiricists, I think they were a school of philosophy, but they explain it could have been psychology too. I think psychology used to be kind of like it's like philosophy in a way. They used to be taught in the philosophy departments at universities. So empiricists explained perceptual constancies as the result of learning through experience, and the Gestaltists said that like something constant, like say someone's walking towards you and they're getting larger and larger in your visual fields, perceiving them as the same size, that kind of thing. A perceptual constancy is a direct reflection of ongoing brain activity and not just a result of these sensations plus learning about them. So perceptual Gestalten came out of their study of perception, and they basically we're kind of experimenting with how we organize what we perceive. They studied subjective and objective reality, where they came up with theories about it. They believed reality is a product of the brain and not the physical world, because the brain is acting on information and arranging it into configurations that we then use to that then informs our consciousness and how we are in reality. Kafka was talking about this subjective and objective reality. He came up with different environments, the geographical environment and the behavioral environment. And it was thought that our subjective reality governs our lives more than the physical environment. Yeah, they studied learning as well, learning and memory and productive thinking. So with learning, they believed that the brain was trying to resolve a tension. The existence of a problem disrupts a balance and the equilibrium of the brain in accordance with the law of Pragnas we discussed earlier. So if the problem is confronted, or if the problem is attended to, you're aware of the state of disequilibrium or imbalance until the problem is solved, and then that relieves kind of like the tension of the problem. So that's their explanation of why we're learning. It's kind of like we're trying to solve problems. So insightful learning is basically if a problem is presented to us, but there are also things that are presented to us that are necessary for the problem solution. If all the things that we need to solve a problem are presented to us as well, insightful learning typically occurs. So they were studying that with apes and stuff. And they also talked about productive thinking. Transposition was, they were doing experiments with chickens, like which sheet of paper the chickens would eat off of, and changing the colors and stuff. And this was part of their studies of learning to see, because so there was like, they were doing kind of conditioning and stuff. And productive thinking was more about education. It was about applying the theory of Gestalt to education. As we talked about, the existence of a problem creates an imbalance that needs to be resolved. So that's part of like being productive, solving problems. The concepts of intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcement were discussed. And Wertheimer thought that we were motivated to learn and solve problems because it is satisfying to do so, or intrinsically reinforcing rather than extrinsically or externally reinforcing. He also believed that problem solving involves the total person and is unique to that person, which is a perspective I appreciate. I feel like that is something that could really benefit certain therapy modalities today that are more focused on thinking and behavior. Whereas we need to also acknowledge that problem solving kind of involves the whole person and can be a unique process. And so lastly, memory. Kafka assumed that each physical event we experience gives rise to specific activity in the brain. There's a memory process, which is brain activity caused by a specific event. And then when that event terminates, so does the brain activity that it caused, leaving a memory trace, which is a remnant of the process, which interacts then with future experiences of the same kind of thing. Like, so if you see a cat, and then you see a cat again, you kind of like, it's brought to mind the last cat you saw, or maybe the first cat you ever saw. And then the second cat you see, your perception of the second one is influenced by the first one. This kind of describes a trace system. So with more experience of the same thing, kind of like your trace memories become more firmly established and more influential in your ongoing perceptions and memories. So it was thought that there was this kind of like a system of memory that that helps make your experiences in life like more helps them be more organized. Like you're not constantly surprised by things. There's kind of like a flow of experience that maybe there wouldn't be if you didn't have these trace memories. So that was one of their theories about memory. And lastly, the impact of Gestalt psychology. I don't have a slide for this, but its greatest impact was social psychology. We didn't discuss Lewin here, but he had students that Lewin was basically kind of like a later figure in Gestalt, slightly later than the founders. And he applied principles of Gestalt to his work. He also had students who were very influential in social psychology, such as Leon Festinger, Fritz Heider, and Solomon Asch. Leon Festinger came up with cognitive dissonance theory. Fritz Heider came up with attribution theory, and Solomon Asch focused on conformity mainly and perception. So these figures were influential to social psychology and basically Gestalt psychology seems to have inspired kind of like the foundations of social psychology. So Gestalt psychology has enriched American psychology and did much to counter the attractions of extreme behaviorism. So behaviorism, just focusing on behavior, not on consciousness, not on like what we're experiencing or how we're experiencing what we're experiencing, more about or just like how we're behaving. That's limited. So it kind of brought psychology more to the study of the mind and redirected mainstream psychology, which has now adopted many points of view of the Gestalt movement. We didn't talk about Kurt Lewin, but he had a couple concepts near the end of the chapter. It says field theory, life space, motivation. He studied conflicts and group dynamics. So yeah, all very interesting things. I think Gestalt was very informative in modern day psychology, and I hope you were able to enjoy the presentation. I was very worried the sound would stop working, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. All right, thank you.